There's the money aspect for sure. How much money is it going to cost to keep these things preserved?
I think the preservation of both the natural environment and the built environment is a duty that you care that belongs to all of humanity.
There's a safety level of how structurally integral are these monuments.
I think we have to accept all of our heritage as well. In many countries, including Ireland, of course, there was a tendency to pick and choose what parts of our heritage we should cherish.
As the old saying goes, nothing lasts forever, and that's never more evident than with history itself. While the past often fades from memory with time, many landmarks remain with us today. These are the physical proof of the past, a statement from ancestors, their work left behind for us. As these castles and structures begin to fall, the question arises: do we preserve these icons or let them crumble with the past?
People didn't have a say. You didn't get to think, oh, no one's using that castle. Maybe we should get some of that castle. Maybe we should get some of that castle money. But it wasn't up to them. This was the thing, is like, it isn't till the last 150 years where the wants of the everyday person has started to actually become more and more important. Everything that we're used to seeing is new, new buildings, new plazas, new roads, whereas here it's all basically restoring what used to be. There's a level at which we need to think of this stuff as cultural. You're not going to be able to put yourself in that time frame realistically anyway. And this is where the art thing comes in. It's not about making you feel like a soldier or making you feel like whatever. It's about making you feel whatever you want to feel, whatever makes you feel. This is art. This is why these structures are so important, because they give meaning to things that otherwise kind of are just unspoken ideas. Can you imagine what Limerick would look like without King John's Castle? Like, it just wouldn't look the same. It's like the toll house, the medieval walls that go around the city. It's part of the character of the city.
King John's Castle is probably the most historic building in Limerick, along with St Mary's Cathedral. It's a symbol of Limerick. It's often featured down through the years on postcards and photographs and images of Limerick. It would often be used to introduce Limerick to a television audience. For example, if there's a report from Limerick, there's frequently a shot of King John's Castle, and the Treaty Stone, which is quite near to it, would be used.
What's the public view about these things? Like, I don't see many Irish people kind of going, just get rid of King John's Castle. We don't need it. Like, it's been around for so long, and it's part of Limerick that you almost can't imagine Limerick without it.
And the strange thing about it is, and some historians have said it should be really called Limerick Castle, because the King John's Castle moniker only really emerged in the early 19th century. Before that, it was always known as the King's Castle, the Queen's Castle, or the Castle of Limerick. And it was built between 1211 and 1297, so it's a Norman castle. And it was a royal castle as well, which means that it didn't belong to a great lord.
It's just all about, perspective, giving yourself perspective and taking yourself out of the modern time and kind of just thinking about what was it like before.
The refurbishment of the castle and the construction or the refurbishment of the visitor centre, and of course the installation of a completely new presentation within the visitor centre. Initially, it caused a number of visitors to increase dramatically, and I think that it remained fairly static thereafter. And I do know, of course, that the COVID crisis now has had a very serious effect. in that the castle has been closed for most of the last 12 months and the staff have been laid off and so on.
You need, from a tourist perspective, you need some sort of landmark for people to go and look at.
The whole issue of whether a building is authentic. There's probably very few buildings in the world that are authentic in that they haven't retained their original appearance or their original function. So buildings are developing all the time, of course.
I don't think tourists care at all whether it's restored or preserved, because at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to put yourself in that context of what it was like in that time anyway, unless you're a historian even historians can't really do it exactly.
One argument would be that an interpretive centre such as the one in King John's Castle should be built in the style of the existing castle. Then others would say that's just a sort of a Disneyfication, a sort of a pastiche, a sort of a pseudo-historical structure. And therefore, the argument goes that it's a much more honest statement on the part of the architect to build a modern structure within the envelope of the castle, so that everybody knows then that when they arrive that, well, clearly this is the modern structure, whereas the rest of it is the medieval structure. On the other hand, if you have a sort of an artificial castellated building acting as the visitor centre, many visitors would probably think it all goes back to the Middle Ages. So therefore you could argue that it lacks authenticity. I suppose it's a debate that has no end really to it. There could be some argument for suggesting that maybe because, you see, the area where the visitor centre now stands, the wall of the castle did continue down there, and it was then knocked down in the late 18th century to act as a parade ground for the soldiers who were who were housed in the barracks. I suppose it might be stated, that the visitor centre might have been more sympathetic to the site. Obviously, after independence in 1922, there was a tendency to disregard a great deal of the built environment that resulted from the British occupation of Ireland. Of course, that argument is that is about 800 or 900 years of built heritage. So, in fact, the vast bulk of Ireland's built heritage would have been built under English and then British rule. I always equate a country to a human being insofar as a person without a memory of their past. Somebody with amnesia, they're clearly a dysfunctional person. And I think a country as well, or a nation that attempts to blot out its past, and that leads to all sorts of pathologies and all sorts of dysfunctional thinking. So I think there is a case for restoring buildings where it's done authentically. It seems to be a very big thing in Germany since the fall of the Berlin Wall. They've rebuilt palaces and churches and even streetscapes all over the place, especially in places like Dresden and in Berlin too, of course. I suppose the danger then, if you look at something like King John's Castle, for example, in Limerick, the danger is then that of I suppose, Disneyfication. Some might feel, I know that there were debates when the refurbishment was being done, 10 or 12 years ago, that there was a danger of Disneyfication, that some might feel it could be improved upon, maybe put turrets on the towers of the castle, which never existed. I think there was some suggestion that there should be reconstructions of jousting, for example. Again, there isn't much evidence to suggest that there was ever jousting in the castle courtyard.
There's a level at which it's just not productive to put a hell of a lot of money into what is essentially a museum. Restoring doesn't, for really old monuments, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I
suppose it depends on the state of the building. If you're looking at a ruinous castle, in the Irish countryside, which 330 years since it was blown up after the siege of Limerick, the last siege of Limerick, rather, in 1691. So I think to restore that now would be, it would be quite absurd, really, in some respects. But a building like King John's Castle then, or indeed St Mary's Cathedral, they are already fairly, they are working buildings. So I think they are deserving of restoration.
At the end of the day, the people who are really going to make a difference in terms of this subject are the people in the city council having these discussions about whether or not this or that.
I think there's a tendency to feel that it's not economic to do something. There wouldn't be the political will here in the Republic of Ireland to devote to that sort of support of the built heritage. And I really feel that cost is often used as an excuse.
I mean, at the end of the day, it all really just comes down to money and space, because, I mean, more here than in other places.
But then I think there's another value to it as well. As I mentioned earlier, I think that, the built environment gives us a sense of belonging. I mean, what is it that makes a nation unique? The Irish nation, or the Canadian nation, or the American nation, or the Swiss nation, or whoever. And in many instances, while there have been suggestions that it was because they lived in a particular area for centuries, or they speak a certain language, most of these are constructs really of the 19th century in particular. So I think really it's a sense of place, a sense of belonging that informs your nationhood. And I think the personality of the nation then is embodied in its heritage and its environment. So I think the sense of what makes us Irish, for example, is very much bound up with the built heritage around us. And if that's lost, and of course a lot of it progressively has been lost and is still in danger, what you'll end up with then is a sort of an amnesiac kind of a nation, which doesn't really have any connection with its past, just lives in a sort of a fairly soulless kind of present,
At a certain point, it's like, okay, the stuff either becomes redundant because no one's using it, or it's a valid part of our history and we should respect that.
I think there's a growing, though still very small, lobby in favor of preservation. I think for various historic reasons, I suppose hostility to what was perceived to be British heritage rather than Irish heritage, and I suppose quite frankly an ignorance and a lack of knowledge of the value of these. I think it's taken a very long time for this sort of realization to arrive on the scene.
They need to be there at the end of the day, because I mean, it's going to cost money to preserve them, it's going to cost money to take them down. So part of it would probably just be what's the cheapest thing to go forward with, and that would probably just be preserving them. I think preservation makes the most sense. I want my kids' grandkids or whatever to come back here and be like, this is where this happened and this is where that happened and all the rest of it. Like, you want these things to be preserved for generations to come, so that each generation after that can then learn about these things. This is why writing things down is so important.
I work for the local authority, Limerick City and County Council, and I'm the curator of the Limerick Museum, which is run by the council. Without the local authority, and many people obviously criticise it, and in some cases they may be correct in their criticism, but it alone has the continuity and the resources to provide these services. While some would criticise local authorities and indeed the central government in Ireland for its neglect of the built environment, I think on the other hand, the private sector, again for various historic reasons, unlike say the United States, where a great many cultural institutions are privately owned and are well resourced, I think our system really is predicated on the involvement of the public sector. I don't think there is a private sector there that's capable of supporting cultural institutions. It's not strong enough, and I don't think it has the particular interest either.
The big way to decide whether it should be preserved or restored is money at the end of the day. You need a level of realism there, where it's like, is this worth rebuilding because it's so significant that it needs to be rebuilt, or do people just need to know this was here and through the years some things have gone but some things have stayed? It's one of those hard questions. For sure, it's one of those hard questions, but it's a hard question we need.